Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There are some nights when the sky seems to turn itself inside out and the sea forgets how to fall. On such a night, while the world held its breath, the rain rose quietly from the ocean, each droplet drifting upward in silvery arcs, as if drawn back to the dreaming clouds. The old lighthouse kept its steady watch, the beam turning slow and sure, humming to itself like a lullaby. Myron, who had long learned to trust the small tugs of her heart, felt a gentle pull, a whisper in the chest that said, "Look again." She stepped out into the damp hush, her yellow coat bright against the storm's soft strangeness. Down by the slip, where the gulls pressed themselves into tight white bundles, a small boat rocked in water that should have been still. There were no oars, no rope, only a basket lined with a blanket the color of sleep, and inside an infant, eyes wide and dark, gazing up at the world's upside-down rain. Myron's hands, more used to the solid weight of lampglass and salt-worn wood, trembled as she lifted the child. But there was no cry, only a gentle exhale, as if the little one had arrived from a place where worry had already been soothed. She named the child Sage, not for wisdom, but because the sound was soft and fitting, like the hush at the end of a story. Carrying Sage back through the lighthouse's round rooms, Myron felt her own tiredness begin to unspool. Some old ache loosened. The air itself seemed to settle. That night, as the lamp's beam swept over the sea, Myron whispered, "You're safe now." And the room grew so quiet it was almost music. Word of Sage's arrival drifted through the village the way mist slips along the shore. Mothers with fretful babies came seeking a moment's peace and found their little ones drifting into sleep when Sage was near. The lighthouse, long a place of watchfulness and warning, began to feel like a harbor for the weary. People left with their shoulders lighter, as if a kindness had reached out and quietly untied all their knots. Sage grew in the rhythm of the tides, first milk-soft breaths, then laughter like the gentle pop of sea foam, then small, sticky fingers learning the curve of banisters and the cool smoothness of stones. Sometimes, when the lamp's golden light scattered across old maps, Myron would glimpse something at the edge of her sight, fine glimmering threads, shimmering like the thinnest spider silk, dancing around Sage's hands. They were never there when she looked directly, but she felt their presence, a soft weaving that seemed to bind the air together, or perhaps to gently smooth it out. Other children came to visit, their cheeks red from wind or worry, and when Sage was nearby, squabbles stilled and play became quiet, as if the games themselves remembered to be gentle. The town's midwife, whose sleep had grown ragged with age, found herself nodding off in the lighthouse kitchen, a deep, easy rest she hadn't known in years. Even the cats, who usually prowled the seawall, began curling up in odd places near Sage's crib, purring in wordless contentment. Finn, Myron's nephew, was 3 when Sage arrived, and 5 when he decided he'd be a proper big brother. He watched over Sage with a seriousness that made Myron smile, bringing treasures, a feather, a smooth pebble, sandwiches cut into stars. Sage accepted each offering with wide-eyed attention, as if every small thing deserved to be listened to. Sometimes Finn caught Sage's fingers moving through the air, as if smoothing out an invisible wrinkle, and he'd ask what they were doing. "It's tangled," Sage would say, not quite knowing what that meant, but feeling it true all the same. Seasons turned, and the lighthouse became a place not just for keeping ships safe, but for mending whatever gentle aches found their way to its door. On winter nights, Myron told stories of harbors and hands, of storms that passed and lights that promised safe passage. Sage listened with their whole self, and sometimes, when the story grew sad, would reach out to touch Myron's sleeve. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, like a blanket shared between them, or the soft weight of hope. By the time Sage could climb the stairs without stopping to count every breath, they had learned the habit of pausing at thresholds, listening for the shape of what wanted to be said before stepping through. Finn teased them for it. Door whisperer, he called Sage. But he learned to pause too, and in those pauses, small things rearranged themselves. The kettle sighed, the wind shifted, apologies found their way more easily into the world. So the days unfolded, gentle as the tide, the lighthouse lamp sweeping slow circles through the night. And in the hush that lingered after each beam, Sage listened for the next note in the world's soft song, ready to learn the language of what waited to be said. By the time Sage learned to walk without holding the banister's worn wood, they had also learned that the world spoke in more languages than words. There was the patient hum of objects that had been loved well, the restless flutter of things that had been abandoned mid-thought, and the deep, settled quiet of places where people had found peace. At first, these feelings brushed against Sage's awareness like sea spray, light touches that left only the faintest impression. But as the seasons turned and Sage's small hands grew steadier, the impressions deepened into something more like listening. The first time Sage truly felt the weight of someone else's emotions clinging to an object. They were helping Mirren sort through a box of donated items for the village families. Their fingers brushed against the worn velvet arm of what had once been Mrs. Holloway's reading chair, and suddenly the air grew thick with a loneliness that tasted like cold tea and unfinished letters. Sage pulled their hand back, eyes wide, and whispered, "It misses her." Mirren paused in her folding, watching as Sage stood very still, head tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. "What does it feel like?" she asked gently, and Sage searched for words that didn't quite exist yet. "Like when you're hungry, but for hugs instead of sandwiches." It stuck in the soft parts. From that day forward, Sage began to notice that feelings had their own textures and weights. Joy felt golden and warm, like honey pooled in sunlight, often settling into well-loved rocking chairs and kitchen tables where families gathered. Sadness was heavier, sometimes clinging to doorframes like morning mist that forgot to burn away. The village bakery held decades of shared laughter, kneaded into its very walls, while the old pier carried the salt-sweet ache of too many goodbyes whispered to departing ships. Finn, 3 years older and steady as the lighthouse beam itself, learned to read these moments in his younger sibling's face. He watched for the way Sage's eyes would grow distant and thoughtful, the careful way they'd reach out to touch something, then pause. When Sage froze at the threshold of the widow Thompson's cottage, overwhelmed by the accumulated sorrow that seemed to pool in every corner, Finn would take their hand and whisper, "Just the happy parts today, okay?" And somehow, Sage learned to choose which emotional layers to acknowledge, like tuning a radio to find the clearest station. Together, they developed a language that existed mostly in glances and small gestures. 2 taps on the table meant "I'm okay," just listening. A hand over the heart and then released into the air meant "this needs space to breathe." When Sage's fingers moved through the air in that particular smoothing motion, Finn knew they were trying to untangle something invisible, and he'd create a gentle distraction, pointing out a particularly interesting cloud or suggesting they count the fishing boats on the horizon. The lighthouse became their practice ground, a gentle museum of accumulated feelings. The old ropes in the storage room held the anxious tension of storms weathered and ships guided safely home. Myron's worn gardening gloves hummed with the quiet satisfaction of soil turned and seeds planted with hope. Even the lamp room itself felt charged with decades of steady vigilance, each night's watch adding another layer of protective intention to the curved walls. Sage wasn't overwhelmed by these perceptions. Instead, it felt like listening to a symphony of soft notes, each contributing to the overall melody of life around them. Finn helped Sage understand that not all feelings were meant to be fixed, but simply witnessed, acknowledged, and then allowed to gently fade like ripples in a pond. Their afternoons were often spent exploring the village's emotional landscape. At the harbor, Sage would sometimes pause by an old mooring post, palm hovering just above the weathered wood. "It's heavy," Sage would whisper, not with fear but with concentration. Heavy like tired. Like it held on for a long time and nobody said thank you. Finn, who had learned to trust Sage's perceptions completely, would thump the post gently with his small fist. "Thank you," he'd say to it as if this were the most obvious kindness. The gesture always seemed to lighten something in the air around them. Mirren watched this careful dance between her boys with wonder and gentle concern. Some evenings she'd find Sage sitting by the lighthouse lamp, very still, as if listening to something far away. "What do you hear up here?" she asked one night, settling beside them on the curved bench. "Everything gets quieter when it's high up," Sage said, leaning into Myron's warmth. "Like the sad parts can't climb stairs very well." They pointed out at the village below, where windows glowed like scattered stars. "See how the light from the houses looks happy?" But sometimes there are dark spots between them, where people forgot to say the important things. Mirren felt her heart catch with understanding. And what do you do with the dark spots? Sage considered this seriously, their young face thoughtful in the lamp's golden glow. I can't fix them, but sometimes I can make them feel less alone. Like when Finn gets scared, and I sit with him until the scared feeling gets smaller. As the lamp turned its steady circle through the night, Sage listened for the next note in the world's soft song, while Finn kept watch beside them, guardian of these tender moments of discovery. The morning after their conversation about dark spots between houses, Sage woke to find Myron already moving through the lighthouse's spiral rooms, with that particular quiet purpose that meant someone would be climbing their steps before the day grew old. There was a quality to the air, a gentle heaviness like the pause before rain that both Sage and Myron had learned to recognize. It whispered of memories too large for one person to carry alone, of hearts that needed witnessing more than fixing. Myron beckoned Sage up to the lamp room after breakfast, where the great lens caught the morning light and scattered it in golden pools across the curved walls. Finn followed with bread wrapped in his favorite cloth, printed with tiny anchors, settling cross-legged near the window where he could watch the harbor while staying close enough to help if needed. It had become their natural arrangement, Myron at the center, Sage beside her learning, Finn nearby like a steady shore. I want to show you something I've kept safe up here, Myron said, opening a narrow drawer built into the lamp's brass housing. Inside lay what looked like ordinary treasures, a child's marble that caught light like a trapped rainbow, a pocket watch with hands frozen at 3:30, a length of blue ribbon soft with age, a brass button that had lost its coat. People bring these when they don't know what else to do with the feelings that won't let go. I can't hear the stories the way you can, but I feel when someone is carrying a memory that's grown too heavy for their shoulders alone. Sage reached for the ribbon first, drawn by something familiar, yet different from the emotional residue they usually perceived. This wasn't just the echo of past feelings, this was deeper, more personal, like touching the edge of someone's most tender secret. It remembers dancing, Sage whispered, then paused, feeling for the right words. But also remembers when the dancing stopped. Someone kept it because they couldn't bear to forget, but couldn't bear to remember either. Myron nodded, watching Sage's careful face with gentle attention. My gift isn't like yours, little one. I can't feel the texture of loneliness in a chair or hear the stories that objects remember. But I can sense when someone walks into a room carrying a memory that's become too dense, too concentrated for them to process alone. It feels like a change in pressure, the way the air grows thick before a storm. That's when I know to be very still, very present. Sometimes stillness itself can be a kind of sanctuary. She showed Sage how she tended these moments, not with words or advice, but with the simple ritual of lamp care. Trimming the wick so the light would burn clean and steady, polishing the glass with slow, meditative circles, breathing in rhythm with the beam's patient sweep. When there's heaviness in the room, she explained, we don't try to lift it away by force. We create a space beside us where it can rest safely. Light doesn't argue with darkness, it simply offers another way of seeing. As if summoned by their quiet conversation, footsteps echoed on the spiral stairs. Sarah Brennan appeared, her baby Emma fussing in tired, persistent cries that spoke of sleepless nights and worried hearts. Behind her came her husband Thomas, his fisherman's cap twisted in weathered hands, both parents worn thin by weeks of trying to soothe their inconsolable daughter. Mary Kelligan said you might, Thomas began, then stopped, uncertain how to ask for help with something he couldn't quite name. Myron welcomed them without questions, settling Sarah in the rocking chair by the window, while Sage approached slowly, head tilted in that listening way that had become as natural as breathing. Within moments of Sage's presence, Emma's cries began to gentle, not stopping entirely but shifting from distress to something more like conversation. She's carrying something too big for such small hands, Sage said quietly, placing a gentle palm on Sarah's arm. The air around them shimmered with that familiar pattern of emotional threads, and Sage could see the heavy grey strand connecting mother and daughter, not harmful, but tangled with a grief that had nowhere else to go. You miss someone very much. Sarah's tears came then, the kind that sound like relief finally finding its voice. My mother died the week before Emma was born. I thought I was managing, but... As she wept, Emma's fussing gradually stilled, until the baby was simply watching her mother's face with curious, clear eyes. Myron moved through the room with the practiced grace of someone who had witnessed countless such moments, offering tea and quiet presence while Sage worked in their gentle, invisible way. Not fixing or removing Sarah's grief, but helping to untangle it from Emma's small spirit, allowing each to carry only what belonged to them. After the Brennan family left, Emma sleeping peacefully, Sarah's step lighter than it had been in weeks, Myron drew Sage close on the lamp-room bench. "This is the heart of lighthouse keeping," she said softly. "Not just the turning of lights and polishing of glass, but offering steady presence while people do the brave work of feeling their feelings all the way through. Your gift lets you see the actual connections, the places where emotions get knotted or stuck. Mine helps me sense when someone needs permission to set something down for a while." The afternoon light was beginning to slant golden across the water when Sage asked the question that had been growing quietly in their mind. "What if the tangles are too tight? What if I can't help them come loose?" "Then you sit with them anyway," Myron said simply. "Sometimes the greatest gift is just being present while someone struggles with something difficult. Like this lighthouse beam, it doesn't stop the storms, but it helps people find their way through them." As evening approached and the tide began its slow retreat, Sage felt that familiar shimmer at the edges of their perception. Down on the shore, tide pools were beginning to emerge like secret windows in the stone, and something about their patient revelation felt important, connected to everything they'd been learning about witnessing and presence and the gentle art of holding space for what needed to be seen. The next morning brought one of those pearlescent days when the sea seemed to exhale light with each wave, and Sage woke with an inexplicable pull toward the shore. Something in the air felt different, charged with possibility the way it does before snow or after long rain. Finn, sensing adventure in the careful way Sage moved through breakfast, abandoned his plan to help Myron inventory the lamp oil, and followed his younger sibling down the familiar path worn smooth by generations of feet, seeking the ocean's wisdom. The tide had pulled back, like a gentle curtain, revealing its secret gardens cupped in stone, each pool a perfect mirror reflecting clouds and sky. Sage knelt beside the largest basin, where anemones swayed like underwater flowers, and hermit crabs conducted their endless house-hunting expeditions. At first, there was only the familiar hush of concentrated attention, the way the world grew still when Sage listened for its deeper languages. Then, as naturally as stars appearing in a darkening sky, they began to see threads, gossamer fine filaments that caught the morning light like spider silk after rain, stretching between the living things in delicate shimmering arcs. Not physical threads, Sage understood this instinctively, but something more essential. Connections made visible by whatever gift had arrived with them on that upside-down rain night years ago. "Finn," Sage whispered, not wanting to disturb whatever was revealing itself. "Do you see the lines?" Finn crouched beside them, following Sage's gaze across the tide pool's surface. He saw the usual wonders, sea stars clinging to rocks, mussels clustered in purple-black colonies, the flash of tiny fish darting between fronds of kelp. But no threads. "Tell me what you're seeing," he said gently, settling cross-legged on the sun-warmed stone. "Paint it with words so I can almost see it too." Sage's fingers traced patterns in the air, following connections invisible to Finn, but clearly mapped in their perception. "The golden ones are strongest," they said, pointing toward a pair of sea anemones that seemed to pulse in gentle rhythm with each other. "They're thick and warm, like honey in sunlight. That's where the deepest love lives. Not the excited kind, but the steady kind that doesn't need special occasions or perfect weather." As Sage spoke, their vision expanded beyond the tide pools. Golden threads stretched between the lighthouse and the village, connecting Myron to the families she'd helped through difficult nights, linking neighbors who left soup on doorsteps during illness, binding the baker to the children who pressed their noses against his window each morning. These connections glowed with an unwavering warmth that distance couldn't diminish. "The silver ones are different," Sage continued, watching a delicate strand shimmer between two gulls sharing the morning's fishing grounds. "They're about understanding, when people know what it feels like to carry the same kind of worry or joy. Like how Captain Morrison and the harbour master both know what it means to watch ships disappear over the horizon and wonder if they'll return safely." Finn watched Sage's face transform with wonder. the same expression they wore when listening to Myron's stories or feeling the emotional weight of cherished objects. He'd learned to trust these moments, even when he couldn't share the exact experience. "What about the broken ones?" he asked, remembering Sarah Brennan's heavy grief and how it had tangled with baby Emma's spirit. Sage's expression grew thoughtful, tinged with the gentle melancholy that made them wise beyond their years. Some threads get knotted when people carry hurts too long without talking about them. Others grow thin when friends drift apart without meaning to. And sometimes, Sage paused, watching a place where a severed thread end drifted like seagrass in an invisible current. Sometimes they break completely, usually under the weight of grief that's too big for one heart to hold. But even as Sage described the fragility of these connections, they noticed something else. When they breathed slowly and let their attention rest on a loving thread, the golden cord that linked them to Finn, for instance, it seemed to resonate, humming with a soundless music that was almost a feeling. Nearby filaments relaxed in response, as if kindness traveled along the weave, not fixing knots, but reminding them of their original shape. "It's like tuning," Sage told Finn, smiling at the simplicity of the discovery. "Like when you hum, and the lamp glass sings along. I can't fix the tangles, but maybe I can help them remember how they're supposed to sound." They spent the morning exploring this new landscape of connection. Sage learned to distinguish the iridescent threads that linked people in creative collaboration, the rainbow shimmer that connected the village musicians during their evening gatherings, or the subtle glow between gardeners who traded seeds and stories with equal generosity. They watched how small acts of kindness brightened existing connections, how genuine apologies could begin to unknot old hurts, how simply witnessing someone's pain without trying to fix it could strengthen the silver threads of understanding. As the tide began its slow return, covering the stone mirrors with gentle laps of foam, Sage felt a new kind of responsibility settling around their shoulders. Not the weight of fixing everyone's problems, but the lighter, more sustainable burden of seeing clearly and offering presence when the world's invisible architecture needed tending. Walking home with the lighthouse beam beginning its evening sweep above them, Sage understood that their gift wasn't just about perceiving emotions or seeing connections. It was about learning to move through the world's delicate web without tearing anything that wasn't ready to change, and perhaps with careful attention and infinite gentleness, helping others do the same. The morning after Sage's discovery of the shimmering threads came too soon, arriving with an absence that felt like a held breath. Henrik the baker, whose hands had shaped the village's daily bread for 40 years, had passed quietly in his sleep, leaving behind an oven grown cold and a silence that seemed to pool in every doorway. The news reached the lighthouse through young Tommy Fletcher, who climbed their steps with tears still wet on his cheeks and flour dust on his jacket from where he'd pressed against the bakery window, trying to understand why the warm light that had welcomed him every morning would never glow again. Sage felt the village's grief before seeing it, a sudden heaviness pressing against their chest like storm weather gathering speed. When they looked toward town with their gift site, the network of golden and silver threads that usually hummed with gentle connection had transformed into something more complex and painful. The thick golden cords that had radiated from Henrik's bakery, connecting him to every child who'd counted treats, every fisherman who'd shared early morning coffee, every mother who'd found comfort in his patient listening, were pulling tight with desperate grief, creating knots throughout the village's emotional weave. "We should go," Sage whispered, and Mira nodded, understanding that this was the moment all their gentle lessons had been preparing for. Finn gathered their coats while Sage stood very still, watching the emotional storm building over their community like weather that needed careful navigation. The bakery had become the heart of the village's mourning, its windows dark, but surrounded by people who couldn't quite bring themselves to leave. Mrs. Callaghan sat on the front step, clutching Henrik's final loaf to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Captain Morrison stood with his weathered cap in his hands, staring at the empty display case where warm rolls had greeted him every dawn for 20 years. Children pressed small faces against the glass, confused by the absence of the gentle giant who had always saved them the sweetest corners of his morning pastries. Sage approached slowly, feeling the weight of accumulated sorrow like a physical pressure. The threads connecting these grieving hearts had become a dense web of shared pain. each person's loss amplifying the others until the air itself seemed to pulse with collective hurt. But underneath the surface tangle, Sage could perceive the golden threads of love that had connected each villager to Henrik, still there, still strong, but pulled so tight by everyone's desperate attempt to hold on to what was gone that they were beginning to fray. "They're trying to keep him here by not letting go," Sage murmured to Mirren, "but the threads are getting so tight they're cutting off the good memories." Myron watched her young charge with steady attention, ready to offer guidance but trusting Sage's instincts. "What do you think they need?" she asked gently. Sage sat down on the bakery steps beside Mrs. Callaghan, not speaking at first, just breathing in rhythm with the older woman's quiet sobs. Something in that simple presence seemed to create space, and gradually other villagers settled nearby, not planned but organic as the tide pools they'd explored just yesterday. The children gravitated towards Sage naturally, and soon a loose circle had formed around the bakery's threshold. "Tell me about the bread," Sage said softly to Mrs. Callaghan, and the simple invitation opened something that had been locked tight with sorrow. She began to speak of Henrik's flour-dusted hands, how he'd taught her grandson to knead dough with patience instead of force, how he'd always set aside the end pieces because he knew they were her favorite. Her words seemed to ease something in the air, and Captain Morrison found himself adding his own memory of Henrik, staying up all night to bake emergency rations, when the fishing fleet was stranded by unexpected storms. As each person shared their stories, Sage watched the tangle of grief threads begin to shift, not disappearing. The loss was real and needed to be honored, but loosening enough that the golden threads of love could pulse with their own warm light again. The knots weren't being untied by force, but gently breathed back into balance, like a musician retuning strings that had been pulled too tight. Mirren moved quietly among them, lighting the oil lamps that hung from the bakery's eaves as evening deepened, creating a circle of gentle light that held their gathering. Sage realized they weren't trying to fix anyone's grief or make the sadness disappear. Instead, they were creating space for the community to feel their loss together, to let the weight be shared among many shoulders instead of crushing each person individually. This was emotional midwifery. Sage understood, not healing by taking pain away, but by sitting with it until it could transform naturally from something sharp and desperate into something that could be carried with grace. The golden threads that connected each villager to Henrik's memory began to glow with steady warmth, speaking of love that could exist without possession, of connections that death could change but never truly sever. Walking home under stars that seemed unusually bright, Sage felt a new understanding settle around their shoulders. Not the weight of fixing everyone's problems, but the gentler responsibility of witnessing, of helping pain move through communities like necessary weather, without getting trapped where it could only grow heavier and more destructive. In the quiet weeks that followed Henrik's gentle passing, as the village learned to shape its mornings around a different kind of emptiness, Sage began to notice something floating at the edges of their perception, dreams that had been set aside, shimmering like soap bubbles caught in afternoon light. These weren't the sharp threads of active connection or the heavy tangles of unprocessed grief, but something more wistful, translucent as morning mist drifting just beyond ordinary sight. The first one Sage truly recognized belonged to Henrik himself. While helping Mirren sort through the baker's belongings, Sage discovered a postcard tucked behind his recipe notebook. Mountains under bright winter sky, edges worn soft by fingertips that had traced those peaks countless times. As Sage touched the card, they felt it, a gentle shimmer like a dream slipping under a door. Not a memory, but a wish that had been folded and put away so many times it had learned to be quiet. "He wanted to see snow," Sage whispered, watching the abandoned dream pulse gently above the postcard, patient as a seed waiting for spring. Real snow, not just the kind that dusts our shore. He imagined walking through it, making the first tracks of morning. This discovery opened Sage's perception to a new landscape of human longing. Walking through the village with Finn, who had learned to recognize the distant expression that meant Sage was seeing something beyond ordinary sight, Sage began to notice them everywhere. Cast-off dreams floating like dandelion seeds above their former dreamers, waiting not to be rescued or restored, but simply to be acknowledged. Mrs. Callaghan carried one of the most beautiful, herself in a blue dress, standing before an easel, painting the lighthouse at sunset with colors that seemed to breathe. The abandoned dream pulsed gently above her silver head as she sat on Henrik's bakery steps, not with pain but with a kind of patient longing, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to notice its quiet presence. "You wanted to paint," Sage said softly one morning, settling beside her on the worn steps. Mrs. Callaghan startled, then looked at Sage with eyes that suddenly seemed decades younger. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered, and Sage struggled to find words for something that felt more like listening than knowing. "It's still there," Sage said simply. "The wanting. It hasn't gone anywhere, just got covered up by all the busy years. Dreams don't die when we stop feeding them. They just wait very patiently, like seeds in winter ground." As Sage's perception deepened, they learned to distinguish between different qualities of abandonment. Some dreams had been set aside with peace, like Mrs. Callaghan's painting, which had been gently released when her children needed her full attention. These glowed softly, like candles in windows, grateful to be remembered. Others flickered with a different quality, wounded dreams that had been killed by fear or harsh words or circumstances too painful to remember clearly, requiring a more delicate kind of witnessing. Sage began what they thought of as their secret practice, creating an internal memorial garden for these abandoned aspirations. Not trying to resurrect or restore them, but offering them a gentle holding space where they could rest without judgment or pressure to transform back into active pursuits. In the quiet hours between helping Mirren tend the lighthouse and their evening walks with Finn, Sage would sit in their favorite corner of the lamp room and simply acknowledge these floating dreams with the same reverence they'd learned to offer grief, witnessing, without trying to fix. "Everyone carries a garden of forgotten selves," Mirren said one evening, watching Sage move through these new perceptions with gentle understanding. "Dreams that didn't bloom are still rooted somewhere, waiting to tell their story. The trick isn't to dig them up, but to tend the soil around them with kindness, so they don't become bitter weeds." Finn, whose steady presence had become Sage's anchor in navigating these increasingly complex perceptions, learned to sit quietly when Sage was doing this invisible work. Sometimes he'd offer small, grounding observations. "That sounds like it would have been beautiful," or "I bet they're glad someone finally noticed." His simple acceptance helped Sage understand that this wasn't a burden to carry alone, but a gift that could be shared through gentle acknowledgement. This practice deepened Sage's empathy in unexpected ways. They began to see that behind every outward life existed a rich, shimmering tapestry of what could have been, and that honoring these unseen layers was a profound act of love. Sage was becoming something they'd never encountered before. Not just someone who could perceive emotional connections, but a keeper of the dreams that people carried in secret, a living archive of human longing. As winter settled over the village and the lighthouse beam swept through longer nights, Sage felt the weight and privilege of this new responsibility settling around their shoulders like a gentle cloak, preparing them for whatever deeper understanding awaited. The quiet practice of tending forgotten dreams had settled into Sage like sediment in still water, creating a foundation for something deeper. As winter pressed its gentle weight against the lighthouse windows, Sage found themselves yearning for a way to give shape to these ethereal perceptions, to translate the shimmering threads and translucent longings into something that could be held, shared, witnessed in the physical world. The answer came, as answers often do, through the most practical of circumstances. Finn had been sent to collect a repair for the lighthouse's weather vane from a woman known simply as Coral, who lived where the village path curved toward the sea cliffs. He returned with the mended copper rooster and stories that made Sage's heart quicken, tales of tapestries that seemed to breathe with their own quiet life, woven by hands that moved with the same intuitive wisdom Sage recognized in Myron's lamp tending. The cottage sat nestled in a tangle of salt-resistant roses, their winter stems creating a protective maze around walls that seemed to exhale warmth and the earthy scent of wool. Inside, the air hummed with something Sage recognized immediately, the deep resonance of strong, quiet emotions given form and purpose. Coral sat at a loom large enough to hold conversations, her silver hair braided with strands of colored yarn, fingers dancing between warp and weft with the rhythm of someone who had learned to breathe in harmony with her work. "So you're the young one who sees the whispers," Coral said without looking up, her voice carrying the soft authority of driftwood, smoothed by decades of patient attention. Before her, a tapestry was taking shape, not of landscapes or figures, but of abstract forms that seemed to pulse with familiar life. As Sage's perception opened, they gasped softly. The emotional threads they'd learned to see were woven directly into the fabric, creating patterns that spoke of longing, transformed into beauty, of grief given space to breathe and settle into something that could be carried with grace. Warp is what holds, Coral explained, her shuttle moving in steady rhythm. Weft is what travels through time, changing the story thread by thread. You can't force weft across brittle warp. First you tend what needs to stay steady. Her fingers selected colors with the same intuitive certainty Sage used when listening to emotional tangles. The loom is an ear that catches what words can't anchor. When people come with knotted feelings, I don't try to untangle by force. I make space for the knots to soften, to become part of something larger and more beautiful. Sage learned that healing through beauty was another form of the emotional midwifery they'd been practicing. Coral didn't try to remove difficult emotions, but helped transform them. Pain that got trapped in the body becoming poison, but pain invited to become art, keeping its truth while losing its sharp edges, like sea glass tumbled smooth by patient tides. Would you like to try? Coral asked, setting up a small frame with yarn in shades that reminded Sage of the lighthouse beam catching morning mist. Their first attempts were clumsy, fingers unused to the over-under rhythm. But gradually something emerged, not a picture, but a feeling made tangible. Silver threads seemed to map the connections they perceived, while soft greens spoke of growth that needed time to unfold naturally. When Mrs. Callaghan arrived the following week, clutching a skein of blue wool and speaking hesitantly of colors she'd once promised to future paintings, Sage watched Coral work magic that felt familiar, yet entirely new. Instead of trying to resurrect the abandoned dream of painting, Coral helped Mrs. Callaghan weave her longing into something that could be worn, held, treasured. The finished piece glowed with the patient blue of horizons, and Mrs. Callaghan left with tears in her eyes and a lightness in her step that spoke of dreams acknowledged rather than mourned. Sage discovered that some people found it easier to process difficult emotions when they could see them, transformed into beauty, grief becoming sunset colors, anger rendered as the fierce magnificence of storm clouds, loneliness transformed into a single star in a vast welcoming sky. The loom became a place where nothing in the human heart was without its own strange beauty, if viewed with the right kind of eyes. As they worked side by side through the shortening days, Coral taught Sage that art was another language for the gift they'd been developing, not just perceiving emotional architecture, but helping people integrate their complete selves into tapestries of quiet wisdom. The gentle percussion of their looms created a rhythm that seemed to tune something essential in anyone who listened, and Sage felt another layer of their abilities unfurling like cloth released from its frame. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept through longer nights, and inside the cottage that smelled of wool and wood smoke and patient transformation, Sage learned that sometimes the most profound healing happened not through words or presence alone, but through the ancient magic of making something beautiful from whatever the heart carried, no matter how tangled or abandoned it might seem. The lessons with Coral had settled into Sage's hands like muscle memory, teaching them that transformation happened not through force, but through patient invitation. As spring warmed into early summer, the village prepared for its traditional festival of lights, an evening when lanterns floated on the harbor and families gathered to mark the season's gentle turning. This year, something in Sage's perception hummed with anticipation, as if all their winter learning was preparing for a moment they couldn't yet name. Coral arrived at the lighthouse that afternoon, carrying bundles of fabric in night sky blues and dawn soft golds, her eyes bright with quiet purpose. "Tonight feels different," she said simply, and Sage nodded, feeling the same electric patience they'd learned to recognize before significant shifts. Together with Myron and Finn, they began preparing something that felt part celebration, part invitation, a woven pathway along the harbor's edge where people could walk, touch, and contribute to whatever wanted to emerge. The preparation felt ceremonial in its simplicity. Finn helped string lengths of Coral's fabric between the dock posts, creating a gentle tunnel of color that swayed with evening breezes. Sage added small bowls filled with smooth pebbles from their tide pool explorations, placing handwritten signs that read, "One pebble means yes to sharing tonight's dream. You can change your mind anytime." Myron arranged her oil lamps to cast gentle pools of light, while Coral set up a small loom where she could weave whatever the evening brought. As families began arriving with their floating lanterns, Sage felt the familiar shimmer at the edge of their perception. The emotional threads connecting villagers pulsed with the warm anticipation that came with beloved traditions. But underneath lay something deeper, a collective readiness for connection that Sage had never sensed so clearly. The bowls filled slowly with pebbles, each one a quiet yes to whatever magic might unfold. The transformation began as naturally as tide pools revealing their secrets. Someone started humming Henrik's favorite morning song, and voices joined one by one, not in performance but in the gentle communion of shared memory. Sage moved through the gathering with the patient attention they'd learned from Myron, not leading but listening, feeling for the collective heartbeat that was beginning to synchronize beneath individual conversations. As the music deepened and lanterns began their slow drift across the dark water, Sage's perception expanded beyond anything they'd experienced. Instead of seeing individual threads, they began to perceive the village as a single breathing tapestry of connection. The golden chords of family love hummed in harmony with the silver threads of friendship, while the iridescent strands of creative collaboration sparkled between the musicians, the children building sand sculptures, and Coral's shuttle moving in rhythm with the shared song. Without conscious decision, Sage began to breathe in rhythm with this collective pulse, their own gift resonating with the community's natural capacity for harmony. The effect rippled outward like rings from a dropped stone, voices finding deeper harmonies, laughter becoming more generous, the space between people filling with a warmth that made everyone feel seen and held. Mrs. Callaghan found herself sharing stories of Henrik that brought smiles rather than tears, while children who usually quarreled were collaborating on sandcastles more beautiful than any they'd built alone. For perhaps an hour, the village shared what felt like a collective dream of healing, not imposed from outside, but arising naturally from their own wisdom when given space to breathe and grow. Sage stood at the heart of it, not as conductor but as the quiet center through which the community's own music could play itself. They realized their gift wasn't about controlling connections, but about creating conditions where people's natural capacity for love and understanding could weave itself into something larger and more sustaining than any individual heart could hold. As the formal celebration wound down and people began drifting homeward, the intensity gently subsided like tide, retreating to reveal treasures. But something had shifted permanently. The threads connecting villagers glowed with new warmth. Sage could sense that many were carrying home not just memories of a lovely evening, but an embodied understanding of what it felt like to be part of something beautiful and healing. Walking back to the lighthouse under stars that seemed unusually bright, Sage felt a new chapter of their abilities opening. Their gift had evolved from perceiving individual patterns to facilitating collective harmony, not through control, but through the patient art of creating space where communities could access their own deepest wisdom and weave it into shared dreams of connection and healing. The days following the festival of lights carried a different quality of light themselves, as if the village had learned a new way of breathing together. Sage moved through familiar routines with the same gentle attention, but something had shifted in their perception, not just of individual threads or community patterns, but of the vast network that stretched beyond their harbor, connecting their small shore to countless others where people carried similar longings for connection and healing. The awareness came gradually, like morning mist revealing distant islands. During their evening walks with Finn, Sage would pause at the harbor's edge, feeling the pull of currents that carried more than salt water. There were other communities out there, other weaves of human connection that might benefit from the gentle witnessing they'd learned to offer. The thought didn't arrive as urgency or restlessness, but as a quiet recognition that some gifts needed larger gardens in order to discover their full flowering. Myron noticed, of course in the way she noticed everything that mattered, not through questioning, but through the patient attention she brought to tending the lighthouse flame. One evening, as they sat in the lamproom watching the beam sweep across water that seemed to stretch toward infinite possibilities, she spoke the understanding that had been growing between them like a shared secret, Tides go out so they can return, she said simply, her weathered hands steady on the brass fittings that had guided her through decades of faithful service. You have helped this place remember how to heal itself. Maybe there are other shores waiting for that kind of remembering. Her voice carried no sadness, only the deep satisfaction of a lighthouse keeper who had watched another light kindle across the water. The decision shaped itself over several weeks, gentle as the tide pools they'd explored together, natural as the way morning gradually brightened into day. Finn understood before words were spoken, the way he'd always understood the important things. You need to learn what you can't learn here, he said during one of their shore walks, his voice carrying the steady trust that had grown between them since childhood. But you'll come back different, and that's how it should be. When autumn arrived with its patient suggestion of change, Sage found themselves in a harbor city where rivers met the sea, carrying a single bag and one of Coral's smaller tapestries woven in lighthouse colors. The city revealed itself as a symphony of emotional resonance, not harsh or overwhelming, but dense with the kind of complex harmonies Sage had learned to appreciate in Coral's most intricate weavings. Here, golden threads of connection layered over silver streams of understanding, while the iridescent strands of creative collaboration sparkled between strangers who paused to help each other navigate crowded streets. The library became Sage's natural sanctuary, a place where the city's emotional symphony softened to a gentle hum among the patient presence of books and the whispered conversations of serious students. It was there in the afternoon light that slanted through tall windows that Sage first noticed someone sketching patterns that made their heart quicken with recognition. River sat at a corner table, completely absorbed in their work, pencil moving across pages filled with intricate diagrams that captured something Sage had never seen translated into visual form. These weren't the shimmering threads of connection, but the underlying currents and landscapes those threads moved through. Emotional geography mapped with the precision of someone who understood that feelings had their own weather systems, their own seasons and migrations. You see it too, Sage said softly, settling into the chair across from River, not really asking but recognizing a kindred spirit in the careful attention River brought to their invisible cartography. River looked up with eyes the color of deep water, and their smile carried the quiet relief of someone who had spent years perceiving things others couldn't see. I map the territories, they said simply, the emotional landscapes that shape how people move through the world. You see something different, don't you? Something more direct. Their conversations began that afternoon and continued through the gentle rhythm of weeks, unfolding in quiet cafes and along tree-lined paths where the city's emotional currents ran clearest. Sage described the gossamer threads they perceived, golden cords of unconditional love, silver filaments of deep understanding, the way kindness could tune a frayed connection back into harmony. River shared their maps of collective moods and cultural memories, the way unprocessed trauma could create emotional fault lines that affected entire neighborhoods, how abandoned dreams could accumulate like sediment until they either poisoned the soil or transformed into compost for new growth. In River, Sage found not just intellectual companionship, but someone who understood the weight and privilege of perceiving what others couldn't see. Their friendship deepened through shared questions about the ethics of emotional work, how to offer gifts without creating dependence, how to witness without controlling, how to help communities access their own wisdom rather than imposing solutions from outside. Together, they began developing what felt like lighthouse, work on a larger scale, creating small practices and gathering spaces where people could see their own patterns more clearly and make conscious choices about what they wanted to transform. They rented a quiet room above a used bookshop, setting up simple tools, River's maps spread across one table, Sage's collection of smooth stones and Coral's colored yarns arranged on another, and in the window, a small oil lamp that Myron had sent, with careful instructions for keeping its flame steady. They didn't announce their presence or hang signs. Instead, they simply began to be there at the same hour each day, doors open, creating the kind of patient space where people could bring whatever tangles or longings they carried, knowing they would be witnessed with complete acceptance and helped to find their own way toward healing. As winter settled over the city and their small lamp cast steady light into the gathering dusk, Sage felt another layer of their abilities unfolding. not just perceiving individual patterns or facilitating community healing, but learning to weave their gift together with River's complementary wisdom, creating something larger and more sustainable than either could offer alone. Winter settled over the city like a patient listener, bringing with it the kind of quiet that made their small room above the bookshop feel even more like a sanctuary. The oil lamp Myron had sent cast steady light across what Sage and River had begun calling their archive, not of books or documents, but of transformed pain, where people could bring their heaviest memories and watch them slowly reshape into something that could be carried with grace. Their work together had evolved into a delicate dance of complementary gifts. River's maps spread across one wall showed the emotional territories that shaped how people moved through the world, while Sage's collection of smooth stones and colored yarns offered tangible ways to work with the invisible threads that connected hearts across time and circumstance. Together, they created space where individual wounds could be understood as part of larger patterns, where personal healing became a contribution to collective wisdom. Mara arrived after her nursing shifts, hands scrubbed clean, but carrying a vigilance that clung like smoke from too many emergency calls. She stood near the frost-etched window, watching snow fall in the lamplight. "My body keeps expecting sirens even when I'm home," she whispered, and Sage could see the tight red thread connecting her current hypervigilance to the frightened child she'd once been, who learned that safety meant staying ready for the next crisis. River offered one of their city maps, asking gently where the tension lived in her daily routes. As Mara traced her path from hospital to home with a red pencil, Sage helped her notice the golden thread of compassion that had drawn her to nursing, still strong beneath the accumulated stress, still pulsing with the love that made her work sacred rather than simply difficult. They offered a small practice, holding her tea mug with both hands, breathing in rhythm with the lamp's steady glow, speaking one gentle truth into the warm porcelain each evening. Elias came carrying decades of careful silence, his dockworker's shoulders bearing storms long past. "My father was a shouter," he said simply, and the room seemed to tilt around those words. I broke that chain, never raised my voice to my sons, but I went silent instead, and now I see how heavy that silence became for all of us. River's pencil moved across a fresh map, sketching coastlines where voices rose and fell like tides, marking the places where unexpressed love had created its own kind of isolation. Sage placed 2 stones in Elias's weathered palms, one smooth, one rough, asking which matched his throat when he spoke kindly to himself. His surprised laughter filled the room as he chose the smooth stone, and something in his shoulders began to settle. The following week, he returned with a small carved boat he'd made years ago, but never given to his sons. "For the archive," he said, placing it on their shelf of treasured offerings, "for choosing different seas." Through these gentle encounters, they learned that healing rarely happened through dramatic intervention, but through the patient accumulation of witnessed moments. Their archive became a place where nothing in human experience was pathologized or rushed, where grief could ripen into wisdom and anger could transform into healthy boundaries. They developed what River called emotional liberation, practices, simple techniques people could use independently to maintain their own well-being. Some visitors needed help, untangling shame that had nested in secrecy, watching it grow smaller when spoken aloud with gentle acceptance. Others carried grief that had grown stagnant in isolation, learning how it could move again when properly witnessed. Still others brought anger that had sharpened into bitterness, discovering how it could become a tool for creating unnecessary change rather than a weapon that wounded everyone it touched. Word of their work spread through the city's invisible networks, not through advertising, but through the quiet recommendations that passed between people who had found genuine help. They began training others in the gentle art of emotional witnessing, creating what felt like lighthouse keepers for the heart, people who could offer steady presence in their own communities, helping others access their innate wisdom rather than imposing solutions from outside. As winter deepened and their lamp drew longer circles of light across the ceiling, Sage felt something shift in their perception. Not restlessness, but a gentle completion, like the natural pause at the end of an exhale before the next breath begins. River sensed it too, understanding that their collaboration had been a necessary bridge between Sage's village wisdom and whatever larger work awaited. One evening, as snow drifted past their window in soft spirals, Sage paused mid-conversation with a visitor, feeling a familiar pull touch their chest, subtle but unmistakable, like the turn of a distant tide. Through the city's layers of sound and light, they sensed the steady sweep of a lighthouse beam, calling in a language that didn't hurry but couldn't be ignored. The archive they'd created would continue without them, tended by the network of gentle practitioners they'd trained. Their real gift to the city had been demonstrating that healing could happen through collaboration, that communities could learn to tend their own emotional well-being with the same care they brought to maintaining their physical infrastructure. The call came not as sound or letter, but as a gentle fraying in the golden thread that had always connected Sage to home, a subtle shift in harmony that spoke of tides turning and lights preparing to pass into different hands. River felt it too, the way people who work with invisible currents learn to sense weather before it reaches the instruments. "She's calling you back," River said simply, already beginning to sort their maps with the careful attention of someone preparing to tend the archive alone. Some transitions can only happen in the place where they began. The journey home unfolded like a familiar song, remembered note by note, city sounds thinning to the measured breath of waves. The lighthouse beam appearing on the horizon like a steady heartbeat made visible. Sage could feel the village's emotional weave even from the approaching road. The warm golden threads of kinship, the silver murmur of shared history, and underneath it all, a quieter note that spoke of gentle completion rather than ending. Finn waited at the harbour steps, broader in the shoulders now, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who had found his own way of serving. His embrace felt like coming home to a part of themselves Sage had carried everywhere without realizing it. "She's been teaching me the lamp work," he said as they walked the familiar path. "But she says some wisdom can only pass between certain kinds of hands." They found Myron in the lamp room, moving through the evening ritual with careful deliberation, her weathered hands still steady but holding themselves differently, already beginning to release their long responsibility. "The light hasn't dimmed," she said, watching the beam sweep its ancient circle across water that held the last gold of sunset. "But I feel it wanting to sing in a different voice." From the narrow drawer where she'd once kept treasured objects too heavy for their owners to carry alone, Mirren withdrew a leather journal bound with ribbon the color of sea glass. Its pages held decades of careful records, not just ships guided safely home, but hearts that had found their way back to themselves in the lighthouse's patient presence. Each entry was brief but complete. The Brennan family learning to untangle grief from their baby's sleep. Henrik's memorial where sorrow transformed into shared celebration. The Festival of Lights where individual threads wove into collective healing. "This is the real archive," Myron said softly. "The way light creates space for people to tend themselves. You've learned things in the city that I never could have taught you here. But the foundation work, that's still here, waiting to grow." Over the following weeks, they began weaving together everything they'd learned. Finn shared how he'd translated Sage's childhood gift into practices for his students, teaching children to find the quiet space inside when the outside felt too loud, helping them draw their feelings or speak their worries to smooth stones before releasing them into tide pools. "Remember how you used to smooth the air when things got tangled?" he asked. "I teach them to do that for themselves." Together, they created what they called a manual for emotional lighthouse keeping, not rules, but gentle invitations. The pebble check, offering a smooth stone and asking for a simple yes or no before conversations that might ask too much. The lamp breath, 3 quiet cycles timed to the beam's patient turn. Naming without story, touching difficult feelings gently, and letting narrative wait until the heart softened its grip. They tested these practices in small circles. Finn's student Jory, who carried Sunday evening dread like a weight in his chest, learned the lamp breath and reported back, "It doesn't fix the Sunday, but it gives it a chair to sit in instead of making it stand in the doorway." They wrote his words in the manual's margins, understanding that wisdom often came from the youngest voices. Mara, a fisherwoman caught in a recent squall, came seeking help with the way the sea had slipped into her sleep. Through the naming practice, she discovered it wasn't the storm itself but being small again that haunted her nights. She left carrying her fear beside her courage instead of underneath it. As autumn deepened and the lamp required longer hours of tending, Myron led them to the back garden, where roses had grown wild and nettles had learned their own boundaries. "For there's room here for a different kind of harbor," she said, looking at the tangle with the same patient assessment she'd once given approaching storms. "A place where people can set things down and remember how to breathe." They could see it taking shape, benches where the lamplight warmed evening air, a small shelter for Coral's traveling loom, beds of herbs that knew how to soothe without demanding attention. The manual lay open on Finn's arm like a bird that trusted them, its pages mapping not just practices, but possibilities, a living document that would grow with each person who found sanctuary in their garden of gentle transformation. That night, as the beam made its patient circles and Mirren slept easy in her favorite chair, Sage felt the deep satisfaction of work that aligned perfectly with their gifts. They were no longer the child who could feel unspoken words floating like invisible snow, but someone who had learned to help communities clear the air so love could move more freely, so healing could happen at its own natural pace, witnessed but never forced. The garden took shape like a lullaby, learning its own melody, not through force or grand design, but by listening to what the land itself wanted to become. Where nettles had once claimed territory with sharp insistence, paths now curved gently between beds of lavender and thyme, their fragrance mixing with salt air to create something entirely new yet deeply familiar. Benches carved from driftwood offered places to sit and breathe in rhythm with the waves below, while Coral's traveling loom found its home beneath a simple shelter where morning light could dance across the threads. The transformation had happened as naturally as seasons changing, guided by the same patient wisdom Sage brought to untangling emotional threads. Word traveled through the invisible networks that connected coastal communities, not through announcements or formal invitations, but through the quiet recommendations that passed between people who had found genuine sanctuary in unexpected places. Old Mr. Henderson was among their first visitors, carrying the weight of a decades-old argument with his son that had crystallized into a chain around his heart. His weathered hands trembled not just with age, but with the accumulated weight of words that could never be taken back, love that had never found its proper voice. Sage led him to the bench beneath the oldest pine, where fallen needles created a soft carpet that seemed to absorb sound and sorrow alike. Myron joined them with the unhurried grace that had guided ships safely home for 40 years, offering Mr. Henderson a smooth stone worn soft by countless tides. "Sometimes," she said, her voice gentle as morning mist, "when words get stuck inside us, a stone can carry what needs to be said. You don't have to speak it aloud. Just whisper your truth into the stone. Then decide if you want to keep carrying it, or let the sea take it for you." Mr. Henderson held the stone like a prayer, his gnarled fingers tracing its cool surface, while he whispered words too quiet for others to hear, but profound enough to shift something fundamental in his chest. When he finally walked to the garden's edge and released the stone into the waves, the ripples that spread across the water seemed to carry decades of held breath back into the world's patient keeping. Young Elara came seeking different medicine, a girl whose vibrant imagination had been steadily dimmed by years of trying to fit herself into the village's practical rhythms. Coral welcomed her to the loom with colors that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, inviting her to choose threads not by plan or pattern, but by whatever called to the parts of herself she'd learned to keep hidden. As Elara's fingers found their rhythm in the ancient over-under dance, a fantastical creature began emerging from the weave, something with iridescent wings that caught light like captured dreams, a piece of her inner world finally given permission to exist in the outer one. Finn brought his students to learn the garden's gentler lessons, teaching them to feel the steady pulse of earth beneath bare feet, to listen for the whispered wisdom that lived in growing things. The children drew their feelings not just on paper, but with sticks in soft soil, arranged their emotions in patterns of leaves and flowers, discovering that even their most difficult feelings had a place in the vast, unfolding tapestry of life. Sarah Brennan, whose baby Emma had long since grown into a curious toddler, began gathering other mothers for weekly circles where the unspoken difficulties of early parenthood could finally breathe in shared air. "We don't solve anything," she explained to newcomers with the wisdom of someone who had learned the difference between fixing and holding space. "We just make room for the hard parts to be real so they don't have to live in secret anymore. Thomas Fletcher, inheriting his father's early rising, but not his natural ease with people, found his own way of serving through fresh bread, left on the garden's welcome table each morning. His loaves became legendary among visitors, who claimed they tasted like comfort given form, like the security of being fed, without having to ask or explain their hunger. The manual they'd begun writing evolved into something more like a living conversation, its pages growing with insights from each person who found healing in the garden's gentle embrace. Finn contributed his teacher's understanding that children needed to draw their feelings before they could speak them. "Pictures don't lie the way explanations sometimes do," he wrote in careful script. "A red scribble that takes up the whole page tells you more about anger than any description." As summer deepened and the garden found its natural rhythms, Sage felt the deep satisfaction of work that had discovered its proper scale. They were no longer just someone who could perceive emotional threads, but a keeper of practices that helped communities weave their own healing, creating spaces where individual transformation and collective wisdom could grow together like flowers in the same soil, each supporting the other's blooming. The lighthouse beam swept its patient circle through longer evenings, and in its steady light, Sage could see something preparing itself beneath the visible good, the way communities were beginning to reach toward each other, asking not just for healing, but for the language to tend their own gardens of gentle transformation. The letters began arriving like gentle waves against the lighthouse shore, not urgent or demanding, but persistent in their quiet hope. Written on the backs of grocery receipts and tucked into fishing nets, carried by teachers and bus drivers and the occasional traveling musician who had spent an afternoon in the garden and left with breath moving easier in their chest. Each note spoke the same careful language people use when asking for something they're not sure they deserve. "Could you show us how to create what you've built here?" Not to copy exactly, but to learn the listening that makes such spaces possible. Sage read each request at the driftwood table beneath the old pine. The manual spread open beside a basket of smooth stones that had learned to hold whispered truths. River had returned with the first autumn storm, their city maps rolled carefully in waterproof canvas, eyes bright with stories of how their shared archive had taken root in neighborhoods across the harbor city. "People are calling it emotional liberation," they said, settling back into the lighthouse's rhythm as if they'd never left. "The practice of freeing ourselves and others from invisible chains, unprocessed grief, unexpressed love, all the tangles that keep hearts from breathing freely." The phrase felt right in Sage's mouth, carrying both the gentleness of their work and its deeper revolutionary potential. Not liberation imposed from outside, but the kind that happened when communities learned to tend their own emotional, whether with the same care they brought to maintaining their physical infrastructure. Myron listened to their planning with the steady attention she'd once given to approaching storms. Her weathered hands folded over the journal that held decades of lighthouse wisdom. "Teaching the teaching," she said softly. "Not as doctrine, but as a way of tending. Like showing someone how to keep their own lamp burning steady." They began with small gatherings, inviting a handful of people to stay for 3 days at a time. The garden seemed to rearrange itself for these occasions, as if it too understood the importance of making room. Finn built a lightweight canopy where morning lessons could unfold in dappled shade, while Coral brought a traveling loom no bigger than a breadboard, so each visitor could feel the ancient rhythm of making beauty from whatever they carried. Nia arrived with the first formal group, her factory workers' hands still carrying traces of copper dust, speaking as if each word had to fight past years of being talked over. Beside her sat Rowan, a librarian whose gentle voice carried questions about boundaries written on careful index cards, and Amaya, a midwife from 2 coves away who wore her decades-old grief like a dignified shawl. Present, acknowledged, but no longer sharp enough to cut. They began with the pebble check, not because it was simple, but because it taught everything else without explanation. Sage placed a bowl of stones in the center of their circle and asked permission before each step. "May we begin with silence? May we feel our feet on the earth? May the wind be part of this lesson?" Each yes, spoken or held in the quiet lift of a chin, strengthened the golden thread connecting them, and Sage could feel the circle tuning itself to a shared frequency of trust. Mirren demonstrated the lamp breath, timing her inhales to the lighthouse beam's patient sweep. "You're not trying to change the feeling," she explained, her voice soft as sea glass. "You're offering it a chair to rest in." Nia surprised herself by crying, not the bitter tears of frustration she knew so well, but the clean release that feels like rain arriving exactly when the garden needs it most. "I keep bracing," she whispered, one hand pressed to her sternum. "Even here, even safe, I brace for the next harsh word." Rowan wrote a note on one of her cards. Bracing can be kindness that forgot how to let go. On the second day, they practiced naming without story, placing a stone in their palm and speaking a single word to it: anger, tenderness, brittle, free. Then setting the stone beside a small candle without explanation, letting the garden hold their unsaid details with perfect respect. Later, when the words had softened at their edges, they returned to chosen stones and added context, not to justify the feelings, but to help them feel less alone in the world. Coral taught what she called the ethic of beauty, showing how pain transformed through art didn't disappear, but became something that could be seen from more angles. Nia wove copper-colored threads through midnight blue, creating what she called reclaimed sunsets, all the endings she'd missed while working double shifts. Rowan stitched a small pocket into her favorite cardigan, just large enough for a pebble and a folded note that read, "Ask first, even with your own heart." By the final morning, something fundamental had shifted. The visitors left carrying hand-sewn pouches containing a smooth stone, colored thread, and pages from the manual copied in Sage's careful script. But mostly they carried a felt sense of how gentle changes, repeated with patience, could become their own quiet revolution, not the kind announced with speeches and banners, but the kind that started in break rooms and kitchen tables and spread because it worked, because it felt like remembering something essential they'd always known. More groups followed. A bus driver, who read the emotional weather of entire neighborhoods through mourning faces, a choir director, who wanted to teach harmony to people who'd stopped trusting their own voices, a teenager told she was too much, and a grandfather convinced he wasn't enough. Each gathering added pages to the manual and routes to the gardens. Growing network of gentle practitioners, Finn became their first formal apprentice, translating Sage's subtle perceptions into practices anyone could learn. His gift lay in making the invisible tangible, turning the daily check-in into 3 simple questions, gentle enough for children. What am I carrying that belongs to me? What belongs to someone else? What wants to be set down today? He brought these practices into his classroom, teaching students to find their inner lighthouse beam before difficult conversations, helping them map their social connections and tend the places where friendship threads needed gentle mending. As winter settled over their expanding work, Sage watched River's careful maps, tracking how their practices adapted and evolved in different communities. "It's like mycelium spreading through forest soil," River observed, showing the delicate tracery connecting their growing family of practitioners. Each person strengthens the whole network, but no single point tries to control the growth. The work spread like beneficial contagion, person to person, community to community, carrying the understanding that healing happened not through dramatic intervention, but through the patient accumulation of witnessed moments, through spaces where nothing in human experience was pathologized or rushed, where grief could ripen into wisdom and anger could transform into healthy boundaries that protected rather than isolated, as the lighthouse beam swept across waters that now carried news of healing from distant shores. Sage felt the deep satisfaction of work that had found its proper rhythm, not the urgent pace of crisis response, but the sustainable tempo of transformation that honored both individual healing and collective wisdom, growing stronger through collaboration, spreading through love rather than force, teaching communities to become their own gentle revolutionaries in the quiet war against isolation and despair. Winter settled over the lighthouse like a gentle exhale, and with it came the quiet understanding that some passages arrive not as crisis, but as natural completion. Fyron moved through her final weeks with the same patient grace she'd brought to decades of lamp tending, her weathered hands still steady, but holding themselves differently, already beginning to release their long responsibility to whatever came next. Sage felt the shift before anyone spoke of it, a softening in the golden thread that had always connected them, not breaking but expanding, as if Myron's essence was preparing to weave itself into something larger than any single life could contain. The community sensed it too, Arriving at the lighthouse with offerings that spoke their own quiet language, Thomas's warmest bread, coral's softest yarn, smooth stones polished by worried fingers into perfect gifts of gratitude. "The light doesn't belong to any single keeper," Mirren said one evening, settling the brass key into Finn's palm while her other hand covered Sage's. "It belongs to everyone who needs guidance, everyone who offers sanctuary, everyone who learns to tend their own inner beacon." Her voice carried the deep satisfaction of work completed exactly as it was meant to be, seeds planted that would continue growing long after the gardener had returned to earth. When the moment arrived, it was as gentle as morning mist lifting from harbor water. They found her in the lamp room, peaceful in her favorite chair, the manual open across her lap to the page where they'd written about teaching children to breathe with the lighthouse beam. Even in her final hours, she had been tending their shared work, adding small notes in margins, gentle refinements born from decades of watching. Hearts learned to heal themselves when given patient space and steady light. The village gathered as naturally as tide pools filling with morning light, drawn not by formal announcement, but by the subtle shift in emotional weather that communities feel when someone who held them steady prepares to let that holding pass into many hands. They came carrying the smooth stones Myron had given them over the years, the small treasures that had held their whispered truths, memories of moments when her presence had created sanctuary for their most difficult feelings. Young Tommy Fletcher stood before the gathering with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to carry his own lighthouse beam. "She taught me that sadness doesn't mean something's wrong," he said, his baker's hand steady as he spoke. "It just means something mattered enough to leave a mark when it changed. That's not damage, that's love making itself visible." Mrs. Kelligan added her own understanding, voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to mother not just her children, but the tender parts of herself. She showed us that healing isn't about making pain disappear. It's about making space for everything we carry, so the love can move freely alongside the hurt. As evening approached, Coral brought her traveling loom to the water's edge, and together they began weaving something unprecedented, not a tapestry of Myron's image, but of her presence. Steady gold threads of unwavering acceptance, silver strands of patient wisdom, the deep blue of harbor nights when her light had guided lost souls safely home. Each person contributed threads from their own healing journey, creating a collective artwork that pulsed with living memory. They lit small oil lamps from the lighthouse flame, each person carrying one to the shore as stars began emerging in the darkening sky. River had mapped the emotional currents of their circle, showing how individual grief was weaving itself into collective gratitude, how sorrow was transforming into the kind of love that could be carried forward rather than buried with the beloved. As they released their lamps onto gentle waves, the harbor filled with floating lights that bobbed and danced like stars reflected in dark water. Sage watched the golden threads that had connected each person to Myron shimmer and stretch, not breaking, but expanding, weaving themselves into the connections that now linked each villager to the others, stronger and more luminous than before. Standing in the lamp room where they had first learned to listen for the world's unspoken languages, Sage felt something complete itself, not an ending, but a transformation as natural as seasons changing. Myron's death had become a masterclass in letting go with love, demonstrating that the deepest chains weren't the ones that bound them to pain, but the attachments that tried to hold love in specific forms rather than allowing it to flow freely through whatever vessels could receive it. The lighthouse beam swept its patient circle through the night, tended now not by a single keeper, but by a community that had learned Myron's art of creating space where healing could happen at its own natural pace. Her light hadn't disappeared. It had simply found new ways to shine, diffusing into the very air they breathed, becoming the shared wisdom that would guide them forward into whatever gentle revolutions awaited their tender tending. Years had moved through the lighthouse like gentle tides, each season adding its own layer of wisdom to the story that began on a night when rain forgot which way to fall. Sage, now an elder with hair the color of seafoam and lines at the corners of their eyes that spoke of decades spent smiling at small miracles, sat in the lamp room where it all began. The brass fittings were warm beneath weathered hands that had learned to tend not just individual hearts, but entire communities learning to breathe together. The lighthouse beam swept its patient circle through evening air that still shimmered with those familiar aurora-like threads, visible now not just to Sage, but to the growing network of practitioners who had learned to see the invisible architecture of human connection. Finn moved through the lighthouse with the quiet competence of someone who had grown into his gifts naturally, his teacher's hands steady on the lamp controls, still leaving small stacks of sandwiches for tired hearts and hungry visitors. River arrived with the evening tide, their arms full of maps that traced emotional liberation practices across continents. What had begun as a gentle revolution in a single coastal village now pulsed through mountain communities, where healing moved with the patience of stone, desert towns where people learned to find hidden springs of resilience within themselves, and city neighborhoods where children practiced the pebble check before difficult conversations. In the garden below, Coral's apprentices worked at traveling looms, their shuttles clicking in harmony as they wove the day's gathered sorrows into tapestries that glowed with transformed beauty. The paths that had once been carved from wild nettles now wound between healing spaces designed for every kind of heart work. Quiet corners for solitary processing, collaborative circles where communities could weave collective wisdom into tangible hope, and open areas where voices found harmony without needing to perform perfection. The threads are everywhere now, Sage said softly, watching 3 generations of apprentices gather for their evening circle. Young Clara sketched connection patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, while Marcus shared stories of helping corporate teams learn to breathe together before difficult meetings, and Elena demonstrated how entire communities could metabolize collective grief without drowning in its weight. Through the lamp room's curved windows, Sage could see the manual they had begun so many years ago had grown into a living library, its pages contributed by practitioners worldwide. Each culture had added its own understanding, Aboriginal concepts of country as healer, Japanese forest bathing adapted for emotional landscapes, African traditions of community healing circles where individual wounds became collective opportunities for wisdom. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Sage felt the deep contentment that comes from work that has discovered its proper rhythm and scale. They understood now that their gift had never really been about seeing magical threads or transforming emotions through supernatural means. It was about modeling what it looked like to live with an open heart in a world that often taught protection through isolation, about demonstrating that healing happened not through dramatic intervention, but through the patient accumulation of witnessed moments. The gentle revolution they had fostered was spreading like beneficial contagion, not through grand proclamations, but through quiet acts of kindness, through the courage to be vulnerable, and through communities learning to tend their own emotional weather with the same care they brought to maintaining their physical infrastructure. The invisible chains that had once bound so many hearts, unexpressed feelings, unacknowledged pain, abandoned dreams, had dissolved not through force but through the steady warmth of acceptance and the patient light of understanding. "What do you see now?" Clara asked, her young voice carrying the same curiosity Sage had once brought to their first glimpse of gossamer threads dancing in tide pools. Sage smiled, feeling the vast network of connection that now spanned the visible world. Golden threads of unconditional love pulsing between hearts that had learned to stay open through difficulty. Silver strands of deep understanding linking communities that processed pain together. Iridescent filaments of creative collaboration sparkling between people who made beauty from whatever they carried. "I see the endless weaving," Sage said, their voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent a lifetime learning that true freedom came not from the absence of difficulty, but from communities that knew how to hold space for whatever anyone needed to feel, process, and transform. The work continuing in hands I'll never know. In villages just beginning to remember, they have their own inner lighthouse beams. As the lighthouse beam completed another steady circle, sweeping its light across the familiar landscape of home and out into the vast, unknown sea, Sage felt a profound peace settle deep within them. The work would continue, carried forward by countless practitioners who understood that the deepest healing often looked like witnessing without judgment, like holding steady when the world felt unsteady. And somewhere in that patient light, Sage stretched into the stars, listening for the next note in the world's soft song of healing. knowing that others would always be there to hear it, to tend it, to help it grow. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.